So, how do you turn Japan from this to this? We will look at what changes need to be made from the Mongol Invasions and what effect it would have on Japan and the rest of the world from the discovery of America to the Victorian Age and even the World Wars. To change the entire trajectory of Japan and propel them into a position of power, we need to change some fundamental things about Japanese culture and society. So, we need to choose a point of divergence from where we can start our alternate timeline. During the writing of this video, I was thinking of the Sengoku Jidai period or the American arrival at Japanese ports, but I finally decided on another event. In the year 1270, Japan was ruled by two people, the shogun and the emperor, with only the shogun having any real power. It had around 9 million people, with most of them being farmers, and the rest being craftsmen, samurai and nobles. So, for those who don't know, in the year 1270, the Mongols led by Kublai Khan set out to conquer Japan, so he kindly sent the Japanese a letter demanding their surrender. The Japanese kindly declined the invitation, and Kublai responded with the Mongol navy. Yeah, not the most friendly guy. And then a typhoon destroyed the entire Mongol navy. And then Kublai probably said, that's weird, bad luck I guess. Then Kublai decided to make another army. Bigger, stronger, nothing could defeat and they got sunk by another typhoon. The Japanese were so perplexed by this weird phenomenon that they thought that it was maybe their gods protecting them, and they even gave this occurrence a name. Divine Wind or Kamikaze. No, not that Kamikaze, this one. So now we will start our alternate history. Let's say that after these events, a seafaring culture begins in Japan. With Japanese sailors being sure that the seas are on their side, they start exploring the Pacific and slowly upgrading their ships to be able to sail the ocean. It would be safe to assume that Japan, with a new maritime culture, would quickly begin to form a large merchant class, facilitating trade across the Pacific, from Korea to China and the Indonesian archipelago.
The island of Taiwan could be slowly settled by Japanese merchants as a way of having a closer port to the main trade routes, which could give the birth to an idea of colonialism in Japanese society. Thus, Taiwan would also become a part of Japan, probably governed by a merchant class. This place would spark a new golden age for trading in the Pacific, with Japanese traders constantly exploring new places to learn more and more about the world. Various Japanese ports could be built in the Philippines and Indonesian islands, with some becoming so populated with Japanese citizens that they become parts of de facto Japan.
Now, another great problem for Japan is the Warring States period, or Sengoku Jidai. For those who don't know, Sengoku Jidai was a period of around 150 years of constant wars and unrest, where Japan was split into various clans controlled by daimyos, each fighting to become the shogun or military leader of Japan. This period ended with the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate taking control of Japan and entering a period of 200 years of isolation. Did you catch that? 200 years of isolation. If the Sengoku Jidai still happens, then the chances of a Japanese empire are slim to none. So, let's say that because of the recent expansions into Asia, there is a big enough butterfly effect that prevents the country from breaking into civil war. Now that the Sengoku period doesn't happen, what does that mean for Japan? Well, first of all, it means more expansion into the Pacific, with the Japanese navy becoming more and more advanced and even being able to explore more land, eventually finding northern Australia by constant island hopping in the Pacific.
By this point, Japan would be considered the naval hegemon of Asia. They control everything that has to deal with the Pacific Sea, and it brings them great profits. But on the other hand, China would be the continental hegemon of Asia. The two dragons, Japan and China, would balance each other out, with each trying to undermine their rival. Because of this emerging Japanese empire, we could see China being more aggressive, maybe trying to expand into the Manchurian lands. trying to colonize Central Asia, or even trying to attack down south into Indochina. But most of these attempts would be met with failure, with only the Manchurian expansions being fruitful. But with Manchurian tribes being threatened by Chinese expansionism, they would find an ally in the Japanese Empire, with many turning to becoming vassals of the land of the rising sun. This would encourage Japan to establish outposts in coastal Siberia to maintain a grip on the Manchurian tribes. But even with all of these advantages, the Japanese are at best in a tie with the Chinese Empire, or at worst, constantly attempting to keep a grip on their empire, as one slip up is a chance for the Chinese to exploit and divide the Japanese.
This shaky balance of power would finally come to an end with the arrival of the Europeans in Indonesia in the 1500s. And the Japanese being the first to communicate and trade with them due to their naval hegemony. They would be the first to receive European weaponry, giving them an edge over the Chinese. But the trade wouldn't be only about guns. The Japanese would enthusiastically trade with the Europeans, receiving various technologies over the years in exchange for goods, significantly improving the Japanese war machine and expanding their empire more and more. And not only that, but the Europeans also bring the knowledge of a new continent to the Japanese.
With the Japanese being interested in new ways of expansion, it is no doubt this would spark a wave of expeditions to the east in search of America. It is most probable that the Japanese would first land either in Alaska or Hawaii, based on what routes they take. With the Japanese discovering Alaska, it is likely they would keep moving south until they would found suitable habitats to live. Most of modern-day California would become a hotspot for colonizers, with dozens of cities being established. This would drastically change the interactions between Europeans, as they would have to compete with a competent power on the other side of the world. With more advancements being made in technology, the flexible Japanese empire would be constantly growing in strength, while China would be lacking. Japan would see the advantage they have over their rival and would strike, officially beginning the First Sino-Japanese War. This war would lead to a decisive Japanese victory and would end up with the annexing Korea, but more importantly, it would finally humiliate the Chinese Empire, which would lead to the dissolution of China, with warlords carving themselves various parts of China for themselves. Now Asia is left in Japan's hands. From now until the middle of the 1800s, we would see Japan conquering the entire of Indonesia, intervening in various Chinese wars to take more and more of the former Ming coastline, accelerating the colonization process of the Americas and Australia.
Japan would seem unstoppable, but there are still some problems remaining. First, the shogun and emperor dynamic. In our world, Japan was ruled by the shogun for hundreds of years and the emperor had little to no power. But all that came to an end in the 1800s with the Boshin War. In short, because of the dissatisfaction of nobles on how the shogun was handling the foreigners and allowing them to force Japan out of isolation. Thus, the emperor, supported by various clans, started a civil war against the shogun in which the emperor won and was the sole ruler across all of Japan. Now, back to our world. In a world where Japan practically had success after success, is there any chance of a civil war erupting where the emperor manages to topple the shogun? I don't think so. But what I think would happen is, thanks to European ideas slowly entering society, we could see the shogun and his council called the Bakufu becoming more democratic over the years. The Bakufu would expand to include numerous lords of the realm, becoming something like a parliament, and the shogun acting more like a prime minister, but with the emperor being relegated to being a ceremonial icon with no power, mirroring the British in a weird way. Now, the second little problem would be foreign powers.
Even before the Russian Empire was a threat not only to Japan, but also China. But ever since the fall of the Chinese Empire, Japan surprisingly found itself not alone in intervening in Chinese wars. The Russian Empire was also there, vying for power and slowly expanding its sphere of influence in the region. Japan once again finds itself threatened by a continental power. Russia's main goal would be to acquire a warm water port in the region, and since Japan already colonized all of Siberia's eastern coastline, this would result in a war. In our world, after Japan industrialized, they fought the Russo-Japanese War from which they emerged victorious. It shocked the entire world. At that point, it was unheard of that a non-European country managed to defeat a European great power. In this world, The Japanese would still defeat the Russians, but the situation would be very different. Japan would already be an established power, so it wouldn't be a surprise to anybody that they would manage to do that.
One little side note. During this time in our world, ideas of European superiority would begin to appear, justifying European imperialism. But with such a powerful country in Asia defeating the Europeans and blocking their influence in Asia, I wonder how, or even if, this idea would even develop. Or maybe would the Japanese create their own ideas of Japanese superiority? If you have any ideas, be sure to leave them in the comments.
Manifest destiny would still happen, and the Americans would still want to expand westward. With the gold rush in full swing inside of Japanese North America, it is a very valuable target for the Americans. But they wouldn't be able to conquer the West Coast. In our world, the Americans managed to defeat Mexico and conquer the West Coast. But in this world, California isn't occupied by Mexico. It is instead the domain of one of the most powerful empires on Earth. And there is also a giant mountain in between the Americans and the Japanese. In this world, we could see the Americans taking a different path to what we have seen. Maybe instead of going west, they could project their power in the north and south, maybe annexing the entirety of Canada and some parts of Mexico. This would not only weaken Britain, but also change the entire American approach to global events. From now on, to a regular American, whatever happens in the Pacific would be considered something very far away. And instead, the Atlantic would receive all the attention. Besides America, the most affected by these events is Britain. Another power that would contest the Japanese would be the British Empire. With them slowly taking over India, Japan would be considered a major opponent of the British, but I do not believe either of them would go to all-out war with each other. It is too risky. One battle could mean the end of either empires if they lose their navy. My guess is that it would probably be a constant battle of influence over smaller states between them, something like the Great Game of Afghanistan or the Cold War of our timeline. Though since Britain lost Canada and never managed to colonize Australia in this world, my bet is that we would see a very aggressive Britain, probably extending the British Raj and taking some portions out of southern Iran, taking even more colonies from Africa than they did in our timeline. This Britain would be seen as expansionistic and aggressive to other European powers.
Moving forward, regarding the First World War, I do not think Japan would join either side during the World Wars. They shouldn't have any other real goals in the region, with their focus likely being to keep their empire intact, as holding a multi-ethnic empire with an iron fist could prove to be quite difficult. Instead, we could see them acting like a merchant, selling weapons and sending lend-lease to either the Entente powers or Central powers, and benefiting heavily due to their flourishing arms industry, with tons of factories opening up all across the empire. My guess is that the First World War would go in a wildly different way. With Canada being taken over by the Americans, it's quite possible that the relations between the US and Britain worsen over time, leading to both a weaker Britain and the USA sympathetic to the Central powers, or if not sympathetic, neutral towards the war.
All of these differences might lead to an Entente defeat, with Britain, France, and Russia fighting against Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Treaty of Berlin would be signed, where Britain cedes all of their colonies to the victorious powers and dismantles their navy, leaving the Americans as the sole rulers of the Atlantic Ocean. France as well would also suffer the same fate and be humiliated. During the turbulent interwar period, the world witnessed the rise of various ideologies, each shaping the destinies of nations in profound ways. In China, a fragmented land dominated by competing warlords, a new leader would emerge, driven by a vision of national unity. Utilizing the powerful tools of nationalism and even flirting with elements of fascism, this warlord would rally the disparate factions under a single banner. He would galvanize the Chinese people by painting the Japanese as malevolent imperialists, intent on destroying China's ancient culture and rich history. Meanwhile, in the vast expanses of Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution had given birth to the Soviet Union, a state built on the ideals of communism. However, the Soviets found themselves geographically and ideologically boxed in by powerful adversaries, the German Empire to the west and the expanding Japanese Empire to the east. Despite the ideological chasm separating the Communist Soviets and the nationalist Chinese, both nations recognized a shared threat in Japan's aggressive expansionism. This mutual animosity toward Japan would lead to the formation of a pragmatic, albeit uneasy, alliance. The Sino-Soviet partnership aimed to push back against Japanese imperialism, with both powers eager to secure their borders and exert influence over East Asia. In India, the end of British colonial rule ushered in a new era of self-determination and ambition. The desire to prove its strength and stability in a post-colonial world would drive India to adopt a more assertive foreign policy, seeking alliances and opportunities to establish itself as a regional power. Japan, once a rising imperial power, faced increasing resistance in its occupied territories across Asia. The peoples of the Indonesian archipelago and the Philippine Islands, subdued by Japanese rule, would engage in continuous revolts and acts of sabotage, striving to reclaim their independence. These resistance movements, fueled by a deep yearning for freedom, received covert support from both China and the Soviet Union. By sponsoring these insurgencies, the Chinese and Soviets aimed to weaken Japan from within, creating internal strife that would stretch the Japanese military thin and undermine their imperial ambitions. Not only that, but there was also another threat to Japanese rule: their restless territory in North America. During the centuries, many former colonial nations managed to gain independence from their former overlords, but not Japanese North America. They were simply too close to Japanese Siberia, and it was easier for the Japanese to enforce their rule. But as the Japanese Empire faced various rebellions across their empire, ideas of self-determination began to spring up inside the North American Japanese. After all, why should they die for an empire that is so far away to them? They would be much happier being independent. Amidst this growing discontent, resistance movement began to take shape. The movement, known as the Free America Front, FAF, was a coalition of disillusioned Japanese settlers and American immigrants willing to fight against the imperial authority, inspired by the successful decolonization on the rest of the continent.
As the world entered the 1930s, Japan found itself increasingly isolated despite their vast empire. While Japan had succeeded in establishing dominance across much of the Pacific and parts of Asia, the global political landscape was shifting dramatically. By 1936, the world was a powder keg ready to explode. Japan's vast empire, which stretched from Indonesia to California, was under siege from multiple fronts.
In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin viewed the growing Chinese resistance as an opportunity. The USSR, despite its ideological differences with the Chinese regime, saw a strategic advantage in backing China's fight against Japan. Stalin's goal was to weaken Japan's grip on Asia, eventually turning the tide in favor of a communist expansion. The Soviets began supplying the Chinese with weapons, training, and even volunteers, preparing the future Sino-Japanese conflict into a brutal, drawn-out war of attrition. In North America, the FAF also received covert support from the United States government, which, while officially neutral, supplied the resistance with weapons, intelligence, and funding through secret channels. American sympathizers in the eastern United States organized fundraising campaigns and smuggled arms and supplies across the Rockies, keeping the resistance well-equipped. As the enemies surrounded the empire and resistance grew bolder, the Japanese government became increasingly paranoid. The shogun ordered a massive increase in military presence across the occupied territories, deploying tens of thousands of soldiers to quell the unrest. Many were executed or sent to labor camps in Alaska. With the upcoming war being closer and closer, if the shogun wants to continue his hold on Asia, he must prepare for war. And so, massive drafts began all across the empire, marching head-on towards the war, not only with its enemies, but also with itself.